Hi, my name is Eldon, and today I'm going to show you how to color skin. Now, I just want to quickly say in preferences, there is no one way on how to color skin. There are multiple ways to color skin. This is just how I color skin. The program I'll be using is Paint Tool Side 2, but the tools I'll be using in Paint Tool Side 2 are usually readily available in all the other art programs too, so you should be able to follow along. So there are 5 tools that I tend to utilize when coloring. The first one being the pen tool, second one being the airbrush tool, third one being the blur tool, and the fourth one being a selector, and the fifth one being a deselector. Like I said earlier, all 5 of these tools are usually available in other programs, so you should be able to follow along even if you aren't using Paint Tool Side 2. So this is the drawing that we're actually going to be coloring in today. This drawing has 3 different characters. So one with a darker skin tone, which is my main character Zeph for my comics SXA, which is over on my website eldondraws.com. There's also 2 other characters that are from the same comic, and they both have lighter skin tones. So we're going to be utilizing these 3 characters to actually do this tutorial. One important thing that I didn't mention before is that we're actually going to be utilizing the folder system and layering system a lot. So if your program doesn't have that, then this won't work for you. But if it does, you're in luck because we're going to continue on. The very first thing that I like to do is actually select the entire background of the characters and then make sure everything is like nice and selected that needs to be selected, and then I will hit the inverse selection and then I will create a new layer and just make it completely white. After I do that, I then tend to go into my canvas and then change the background color to a background color of my choice, which is gray for me. This just makes it so that I can see exactly what's being colored in and what isn't being colored in with the gray background, so I know what actually has a solid foundation. After I have that white background and a solid foundation, I then create a new folder. This folder will become the folder for the main character Zeph. I like to separate each character in their own folders so they have their own coloring area so it's not all meshed together, because sometimes I do not like to label each of the coloring layers. So now that the folder Zeph is created, I created a new layer. This is going to be my first skin base layer. So that is the skin layer that has the overall tones that you want it to be. Usually you want to have one that's mid-tone and then have 2 different ones that are one lighter and one darker. So this is the skin tone that I tend to use. You can utilize any type of skin tone that you want. It doesn't have to be this specific skin tone, but I already mapped out everything that I like to use to keep it more consistent across the board when I'm coloring in my characters. So with the first layer, skin layer, I just go around and then color in all the skin. I utilize the pen tool to line out the area, then use the bucket tool to fill it in, and then touch it up with the pen tool once it was done to clean it up. So now that the first base layer is done, we're going to actually create a new layer. In this layer, we're going to still be using the pen tool, but we're going to move on to darker skin tone. So this layer, we're going to go in and actually just go around certain areas where I want the overall shadow to kind of show. And this is just a roundabout of what I want to do. Again, for this purpose, I'm only using the pen tool, but I will be using the other tools in the upcoming future. The layer that we just went in and used the darker tones is now the shade layer. This shade layer is now going to become the basis of how the overall skin and texture is going to flow by us going in and actually blurring it out. But before we blur it, I tend to go in and then select the outside area, the base skin tone, and then do the inverse selection to be able to get a fair amount of what I had the base skin tone coloring on. For whatever reason, sometimes it does not select all of it. So now we're going to go back in with the selector tool and select certain areas that weren't selected that need to be selected, and then deselect certain areas that were selected that don't need to be selected. So just a little bit of touch-ups. There is a caveat to this. You don't have to select these if you don't want to. You can use the clipping group layer or clipping layer tool to be able to make sure that it all stays on that one layer. I just like doing it like this because I'm a masochist and like doing extra work, but you do not have to do this. And shout out to a commenter who said you can make the selection area invisible, so it's easier for you to go through and blur things without having to worry about it. So here we're just going to go through on a blurring spree, essentially, just to soften it out a little bit. Currently, the only tool that's being utilized at the moment is the blur tool to be able to soften up the darker areas that we just put down with the pen. And now that it is blurred out in certain areas, we're actually going to create a new layer, and then we're going to use the same darkness that we used for this layer before we blurred it, and then we're going to use the airbrush tool and then airbrush over where we just blurred. So the blurring tool tends to leave like a streakiness to it, and then we go in with the airbrush tool to relieve said streakiness to make it a little bit softer, and it blends in a little bit better too with its surrounding areas. Currently the main tool that's being used is the airbrush tool, and then I'm going back in with the pen tool to touch up some places places that I forgot to touch up. If you made it this far and you're finding this video helpful, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. So now that we have the first two darker layers done, we're gonna actually move on to the lighter layers, or this highlight layers. So again, pick a lighter color, then you're gonna go in and just add highlights to specific areas, or to areas that the light would most likely reflect off of, usually opposite of the darker shadows, just to make it pop a bit. Just as a recap, I'm going over with the pen tool just to highlight different areas to make it pop a bit. One of the unconventional areas I like to do is the under the lid highlight, and that just makes it pop a little bit and has the eye stand out. And then with that, once you get the areas that you want to add highlights to, we are actually going to use the blur tool again and then start blurring out said areas like we did with the shadows. One thing I do want to note is that when you are blurring out a thinner line, you do want to change the blur radius so it doesn't just encompass the entire thing. This way it gives it still a nice harder edge to the surface, so it makes it so it leaves a little bit of like a oomph type of shine to it. Now that we have that done, we're going to do another layer and then go back in just like what we did with the shadows, and then add areas that have the shininess to it or the lighter tone to it, and go over it with an airbrush. There are areas that I did not go over with the blur tool that I will go over with the airbrush. This just gives it a nice little feel shine to it to make it pop a bit. And one of the areas that I did not go over with the pen tool to blur it out is actually going to be the top of the forehead. The top of the forehead, I tend to just airbrush it to give it a little bit of shine, because the forehead is usually shiny to a certain extent. The only brush tool that I'm currently using is the airbrush tool, and that is again just to make things have a little bit of light bleed and make it a more shiny. So now that you got to this point, you're actually going to go back and forth between the light and dark, creating new layers on top of each other, just simultaneously on top of each other, until you get to a point where you think the skin overall looks good. You're just going to be using the airbrush tool for this, and you're just going to keep on layering and layering and layering and using different pressure sensitivity to get the overall feel that you're looking for. Again, the airbrush tool is the only one being utilized in this situation. Well, I do want to touch upon why I was harping on creating a new layer for each situation. Creating a new layer for each situation when you're switching between colors instead of going back to the overall base just makes it easier for you to edit in the long run, because airbrushing is kind of finicky when you're trying to edit it. So you could just delete the layer instead of trying to edit it and just start all over again if you want to. Now that I'm in a place where I really like how this skin is looking, I'm actually going to add one more color to this, and that's going to be the red. The red I'm going to utilize around the cheeks sometimes, the ears, and the nose. Those are the main areas that I like to utilize red at. You can also use it around the lips, but I tend to not do so. Create a new layer, and we're actually going to make it so it's under most of these layers. So wherever you put the first dark area, like the first blended or blurred area, you're going to actually use a red color, go in with an airbrush, and then just add red to certain areas like the ears, the nose, etc. that you want to add red to. It just gives it a little bit more of a pop of color. So this is with the red, this is without the red, with the red, without the red. So it just gives it a little bit more of a blood flow, so it doesn't look as just stagnant. You could do the same with the hands, but sometimes the hands don't really show that much, but it's still worth it. Some people like to use blues and stuff at the chin. I don't tend to do that. This is just how I tend to color. So next we're actually going to move on to the hands. So the hands are slightly different than its counterpart, lighter skin. This is specifically for darker skinned people that you're going to do the hands for, because the hands on lighter skinned people are most likely going to be the same. So what I like to do is actually take the my lighter skin tone, then I'm going to create a new layer on top of all these other layers, and then where the palm and everything is, you're actually going to color it in with the lighter skin tone, because darker skin tone people have a light palm. This is just for consistency's sake, and then you're going to do that, and we'll be back once it's done. The main tool that's currently being used is the pencil tool, and I'm utilizing it to just get to different areas, nooks and crannies where the skin needs to be lighter underneath the fingernails and around the edge of the hand, just so it gives it an overall realistic feel. Now that I added the areas where the palm is, the lighter skin tone where the palm is, I'm going to go in with the blur tool and actually blur it out a bit. The only tool that's currently in use is the blur tool. We're going over the edges that we just did to blur it out a bit. And then we're going to go on a layer on top of it, just like we did previously, and utilize the airbrush tool and just airbrush certain areas to make it a little bit softer and blend more into the overall skin. The only tool that's currently in use is the airbrush tool, and we're going over the areas that we just blurred out a bit, just to enable us to make it more softer and give it a more realistic approach of how skin tends to look in real life. Now that we got it nicely blended, we're going to make a new layer and then do the exact same thing that we did with the darker shadows, is go over it with the airbrush tool to give it more of a darker feel to it without having it be too harsh. Now with everything all done there, we're going to go back in with another layer, and then we're going to do some sharp light highlights just to give it again more of a standout type of punchy feel to it. Now for my character Zeph, he is a darker skinned character, or aka an African descent type of character, so he is going to have a little bit darker lips. In order to do that, we're just going to find the layer layer where the lip shine is, we're gonna make a layer underneath it, a new layer underneath it, go to the dark areas, go into the airbrush tool, and then we're just gonna airbrush some darker areas on his lips. Now with the lips done, we're currently done with Zeph, but we have 2 more characters to color their skin in. With these 2 characters, they're both lighter skin tone characters. We're just gonna do the same overall basic concepts that we did with Zeph and apply them to them, but we're gonna do it in a quicker manner so we don't have to sit around and wait too long. Since there's only slight differences that will occur when we're coloring in the lighter skin tone characters, we're just gonna tackle those when we get to them. So with these 2 characters, there were many things that I did differently that I did on Zeph, comparatively speaking to Nagahira and the female next to him. The reason I'm saying the female next to him, because at this point in time, the female's name has not been released to the public of my comic series. So the whole processing of the skin was pretty much virtually the same. The only difference is that I'm using a lighter color, and one of the differences was on Nagahira, he has a scar, so I did the scar separately from the overall skin, but they followed the same skin practices of when I was actually going in with the scar. The only other difference was that I used the red a lot more. So I used the red in a lot of the cheeks, the lips, the nose, the same places that I used with Zeph, but I also used it more in the arms and the hands because lighter people tend to have more redness in their skin, so it's just more of a trying to get a balance of reality and the overall digital aspects of this not being a photorealistic person. I did actually do a little bit of harder pressure when I was doing the redness too, just to make it pop a bit, because again, redness does tend to show up more through lighter skin characters versus darker skin characters. So here are the final close-up shots of the skin. I really like how the skin turns out every time I do it, and I just keep on getting better and better at it, just getting the visual aspect that I want to achieve once I start doing coloring, because I originally did not know how to color. So I really like how this is turning out and how my skills have been developing over time. So I want to reiterate what I said earlier in the video, is that this is not the only way of how to color. Even though this is a video of saying how to color, this doesn't mean that it's the only way how to color. There are different ways to color. This is just the way I like to color and wanted to share it out with people and see if they could vibe with it too, or want to take certain aspects and then mold it into their own way of how to color. That's all this tutorial is for. So if you find anything that you want to take away from this video, that's a net positive. Anyways, I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and if you haven't subscribed yet, consider subscribing. It's free and it helps me out a lot. Also, liking the video and commenting down below also helps me a lot too. So once again, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Peace. Bye-bye. Man, this video took a long time to edit.